Very excited. We have two very excellent presenters today, Mr. Jeremy Stolfus, Mr. Matt Slazak. With that, I give you Matt and Jeremy.
Thanks, Keith, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. So Matt and I are going to be speaking about action requests in GHR, specific to how IPA interacts with them, and just the power of IPA, how it's embedded within the application.
There we go.
All right. Today, so what we're going to talk about today. So first, we're going to go over just what exactly is an action request. It's something that's unique to the Landmark applications. So we'll speak about that. And when we look at how it relates to IPA, process automation, we're going to look at some things that are very specific to action requests. And then we'll go into some discussion about just some general guidelines and best practices of what we should be doing with our IPAs. And then we'll take questions at the end. But feel free to post your questions all along the way.
All right, so what is an action request? If you're familiar with the S3 world, we're very used to personnel actions and things like that. So really, an action request in GHR is the equivalent of a personnel action from the S3 side. So what you used to do on a PA52, for example, you're basically going to have that. You're going to do the same thing in GHR, just through an action request. The action request itself is something that can be kicked off by any number of people. An employee or a manager frequently will be doing that. You can also have administrators or generalists kicking it off, but it tends to be mostly that a manager or employee will be the ones who really kick that off. The key on this is when you're thinking about the action request, it will be going for approval more often than not. And so that's why you see it usually at the employee and manager level. It is configured to pull in the initiator, the approver, and the final approver. Those are kind of things that are kind of built innately into the action request itself. The key on this is really that it's going to be eliminating your paper forms. So you're not going to be sitting there handing a napkin back and forth saying transfer this person or hire this person, fire this person. We've got that all built into the system. It's going to hold on to all that data. So you're really getting rid of those paper forms. I have seen people who have rolled out GHR and still are using those paper forms. GHR is there so that we don't have to use those forms anymore. It is built into the core of GHR, okay? Global HR works best when you're using these actions. You're going to roll them out. You're going to use this as your real interface. This is the power behind your GHR implementation. You want your employees, you want your managers to be kicking off these actions and really, enable the system to do what it does best. It wants to route this information back and forth. It wants to get the approvals in there, and it's going to be tracking all of this information through. So when you get to the back end of it, an action request itself is basically a temporary instance of a business class record. So if I'm kicking off a transfer action, it's actually building in a temporary action within the work assignment business class. And it's holding on to the information of everything that you're changing on that record. So that's how it's kind of holding on to that in the background. The key on these is that the action requests themselves are configurable. Anything that you want to display on the screen or suppress on the screen, you're going to be able to do. If you've watched I know you and I have both done many presentations on Configuration Console and how much we love that tool by itself. You can put just about any kind of constraints on forms, on the action requests themselves. Make sure that people are putting in proper data. You can do your data validation right up front in the form as well as on the background. The process flow is going to run in the background. That's going to drive the personnel or the action request itself. So you will define a process flow. It can be an out-of-the-box one, and you just configure it. You can modify those and just save them off as something slightly different. But most importantly, you're going to be supporting all of your business logic and business decisions with these action requests. You're going to make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed with them. And most importantly, I think, is from an auditability standpoint, everything that you're doing in an action request, you're going to be able to track through and see who signed off on it, when did they sign off on it. We can track comments, we can track reason codes. It's really nice that you can see that full audit trail built into it.
So one thing to note here, there's also in GHR a feature called state actions, and these are just slightly different from an action request. These are built-in processes within the application, and there is not an associated process flow that goes along with them. So you cannot control these, you can't change these, modify them too much. Typically they're driven off of email templates that are then defined in the system. So just a little note, there are definitely some processes where you would think that it should be an IPA and you can just go in and modify it, but you can't. Right. So now we start digging into some of the details of it. And when you pick up one of those delivered process flows and you start looking at it, you'll notice two very unique things about those process flows. There are two nodes that are inherent in every single action request flow that comes delivered. Generally speaking, they're not really named, but landmark 7650 is the node name identifier, and what that one is going to do is actually get the action request. So that's typically the very first node that you'll see in the process flow. And this is where it's retrieving that data, that temporary storage that was created when the user submitted the action. So you're retrieving all of the parameters and everything that you need to know that defines the action request. Then on the tail end, there's a landmark 8000 node. And this is where that final transaction gets written and approved to the database. So it gets committed to the database. Once the approval is done, the landmark 8000 takes that and writes it out. Now, if it's future dated, of course, it will still be in a pending state until that effective date holds true. But that landmark 8000 node is a critical piece of the process flows as well. Sorry, this is mine too. So let's talk about display types. When we look at the work when it gets routed to an employee or a manager or someone for approval, typically you're going to want this set to action request, and this is how these flows are delivered. And what that does is then it shows the native application screen. There's no special coding or anything that you need to do. Again, this is embedded into the GHR application, and it will just show that application screen, very similar to what the initiator filled out. Now this is configurable, and the system knows, okay, is it the approver, is it a first level approval, or is it the final approval? And the configuration console can configure those screens slightly different depending on which approval level this is.
So we were talking a little bit about how it's auditable, and we've got everything tracked through. So the audit log itself is really where you're going to see all of this data. It's going to capture the user ID of who actually kicked off the action and who's going to be doing the approvals. The default of the user action, you can trace through to see exactly what fields have changed in it through the audit log. There's a really nice function in the audit log where if you select two of the lines on it, you can actually compare to see what actually changed on it. And you can compare things from a very long time ago to the current data and see exactly how things have changed over time on it. You can also change this in the flow so that if you have a certain approval level set as the final approver, we're going to be able to see that and trace it through on the audit log itself. Now, Jeremy mentioned the future dated actions or the pending actions. You absolutely can have something that is future dated and do the approvals, and you can do those approvals right now, but that action will not actually commit until whatever the effective date happens to be, if it's 2 weeks out or anything like that. I've seen some people who go in and they'll hold on to everything in the in baskets for the approvals or the final approval, and they'll wait until that day before they actually hit approve. you don't have to do that. It's going to just show up as a pending action in the audit log. Usually it will pop up at the top of the screen or at the top of the audit log, usually in green, until that day actually comes around. At midnight on the day of the effective date, you'll actually see it to become the current record at that point.
Talk a little bit about return versus reject. Of course, when you're talking about approval flow, there's always an approve action, but there's typically a return and a reject action as well. These are defined by the action request itself, so not everyone will have both of those, but typically they do for some of these. How you handle these, you can do different things with them within the flow, and it's all flexible in how your business wants it. Similar to the final approve that gets written out to the database, this also gets set in that landmark 8000 transaction node that we talked about earlier. When you talk about a return, you can build this into the flow logic. So for example, if an approver selects the return action, you can build logic in the flow to actually send it back one level to approval. To the previous approver. So maybe you type in a comment and say, hey, this looks good, except for you need to make this one change. So that's logic that has to be built into the flow to handle that. It's also defined by the action. So typically a return will go back to, it will end the process, but it will go back to the initiator's action list as basically a pending action again. And they can then make changes to it and resubmit that same action again. If an approver somewhere along the line rejects the action, that's the end of that action request. Then the action request is canceled and cannot be resubmitted. If it does need to be, the initiator has to start over from the beginning.
You can kind of think of the return as the yes, but, and really want them to fill in some more information, and the reject is just purely no, just not going to happen. We cannot give this person $300 an hour or something like that. Right. So the approver states, you've got your approver and your final approver. Those are built in, and we can start to see exactly how many layers of approval it has to go through, and it's going to be tracked through that way. When we say that it's approve versus a final approve, you actually can have multiple approve levels, people who are the approvers, but then you're going to have somebody who has the final absolute sign-off. That tends to happen just before you're going to hit that landmark 8000 node. That final approver is going to be the person who absolutely is going to allow that transaction to go through, your final gatekeeper. The nice thing about it as well is you can have totally different views by what kind of approver it is. If you wanted to suppress certain fields to until the final approval, you can absolutely do that, and just really let people focus on the pieces of information that really are important or relevant to them, or pieces of information that they would need to know. We've seen that a lot where people will have almost like a delta at the bottom just to show what's actually changing with it, only to the final approver.
An example would be with a pay rate change, for example. Maybe it's only the final approver that can actually enter the final pay rate, and so it's locked. The field could be locked down before that, and then the final approver has the authority to actually change it then.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we can absolutely change all of those based on what level they are. The configuration console also is going to work with this. So we might change that in the IPA flow to say that this is going to be a final approval node, and because of that, the configuration console will understand that, okay, this is what this person's actually able to see.
So here's an example of the user action node. You see you have the approver state here, approver or final approver, and that's what sends the message over to configuration console. So when that application screen is rendered, you can apply different logic then that will show or hide certain fields or make things valid so that they can be edited versus not edited, depending on that approver state.
So, as you know, with GHR, there are certain actions that are innate. They come out of the box. You've got your change relationship to org, your promote, your transfer, things like that. But you do have the ability to have completely custom actions as well. If you have lived in the S3 world for a very long time and you're familiar with PA52 and allowing some of those actions to be kicked off by managers on the S3 side through manager self-service, you're familiar. We know that we can put certain fields out there and we want to have them only touch these fields in this action request. We can do the exact same thing in GHR. We can create a custom process flow which will collect all this information, which could be from multiple business classes if you really wanted it to be, or just very specific things that people can do. Again, through constraints and configuration console, you can let them only change certain pieces of it. You can also use that same process flow and extend it and allow that same flow to function in two totally different ways. Using some older terminology, that action extension we'll show you in a moment, where we can actually take that same process flow that's running behind the scenes and use a totally different form so that we don't care about certain fields because this person shouldn't be able to do those things. So we'll parse it down and just let them focus on the relevant pieces of information. The other thing that we're able to do with a custom action request is we can have custom subjects and reason codes for them. If you're familiar with how the action requests work in GHR right now, you have almost everything built on the HCM action, and there are specific reason codes that can have on that. When we create our own custom action, we can actually go in and create our own subject and then define very specific reason codes for that as well. So we can jump over to the next one. So here we've got our work assignment for my 2-year-old. He's really not qualified for this job, by the way. But you can see that we added in a custom action request right up at the top. And it's kind of hard to see, but it's called Request Employee Acknowledge Position Description. Okay. So this is a custom process flow that we built out, and when we click on it, you can see that the screen comes up and it's going to be asking specifically, okay, here you are, we're in here, and we want to send a request for this employee to pull up and read their position description. And we can see that the last time they acknowledged their position description was a year ago. So we really want them to update that and look at it, sign off on it. Very important in healthcare that people are reviewing their position descriptions. So we're creating a custom flow that is doing that. So when we submit that action, it's actually going to go over and go to his in basket, and he'll have to sign off on his job description. Here's another example where we're going to change how the hire resource flow works. So here we're actually kicking it off so that we're going to require every single time somebody does this, they have to put in an effective date, they have to put in a reason code, and they have to put in a comment. We can do that, and that would be called I think just the action extension was how that was referred to in the past. I'm hedging because it's changed a little bit between versions 10 and 11, so it's a little bit different right now. So I'm straddling both worlds right now. And then here's a final example where we're actually doing a hire request, which is totally different. We're using the same process flow behind the scenes. It's still using the hire resource, that process flow for all the approvals, etc. But we have a very specific display for anybody who is hiring a non-paid resource. So if you have volunteers or things like that, or people who are not, I guess you'd say, full-fledged employees, you might want to hand that action off to the volunteer services administrator who can kick off this hire request. We're getting a brand new volunteer in the system, but she doesn't have to deal with putting in all this other information. We're just going to say, give us the effective date, the reason, give us the first name and the last name, and we've defaulted in the relationship to organization as a contractor with a specific relationship status and a specific work type. That is using the same process flow behind the scenes, but we just display it differently. So that's a little bit of a customization of our action request.
So let's talk a little bit about alerts and notifications. Of course, we all love getting flooded with emails. So when we talk about an action request and sending something to somebody to approve, you want to give them as much information as possible within that email notification to allow them to make that informed decision easier, and really just present that information right in their face. So what we see is a common best practice for here's the information, the types of things that you should have in your email notifications that go out. You want as much of the transaction header and detail line information that you can possibly pull in and present in a nice display. You can also add in your approval history. So if you've got multiple levels of approval, you can see, okay, well, who approved this prior to me? You know, oh, I see 3 other people already approved it, so yeah, I'm going to put my stamp on it as well. Bring in your names and descriptions. So a lot of times the data that's stored in those action requests is just the code. So you'll want to go out and retrieve that description information from the base business class. And again, that's something you're going to have to, it's an additional query, landmark transaction query, you're going to have to build out in your process flow. But it does become more useful to your end users who are looking at this data and looking at these approvals. You can also, I skipped over it, but you can also supply links to supporting documentation as well. This is just an example of what a well-formatted email notification would look like. And you see here the detail section, just some text fields. Here's actually a link to some supporting documents. And you've got the approval log information down at the bottom. There's also these approval actions, which we'll talk more about in a minute, but just wanted to highlight them there. Continuing on with alerts and notifications. So that well-formatted email that I had done with CSS style sheets. So in this particular example, there's a couple ways to do it. You can create a message builder node that has your style sheet detail all in it, and you just reference that as part of your email. You can also, in the process server administration tool, there's a configuration screen that goes to your translations. There's a very basic one that's delivered out there by default, but you can edit this and modify this to your heart's content, adding formatting, colors, and all kinds of things. Another way to use alerts and notifications within the system. So the application, the Global HR application, has a lot of alerts, notifications that are built in, but not necessarily sending out email alerts. So the little yellow icon that's up next to your name that has a number, a highlighted number, those are going to be any one of these items. So it could be messages from the system, maybe you've got, of course, your action requests and approval notifications that also get flagged there. If you're setting up and using watches within the system. Sometimes when you go in and you want to generate a report and generate that PDF, sometimes if the system's busy, thinking during performance review and appraisal time, the system can get backed up with requests to generate those. That information to say, hey, your document, your report is ready, also gets presented up in that information. And also security changes. So when you've been assigned a new application, you have new stuff that all shows up in that alerts box. So what you can actually do is you can write a process flow to query that. That's all stored in the user notification business class. And you can actually pull that out, looking for messages and alerts that are unread, and send an email alert, formulate an email based off of all that information. You can even, within your process flow, mark that notification as read, and then it disappears off the user's little icon notification in their toolbox. And then if you're running that process on a daily basis, for example, then you don't send that multiple times.
Right. The number of times you go into an implementation and you see somebody with like 999 notifications up there is kind of funny because people tend to ignore it. So pulling it out and querying it that way, I think makes a lot of sense for people.
This is just a screenshot of the user notifications business class and just some of the type of data that you'll see in that. And then here's the icon. And in this example, I can see that I have an expiring certification. And I can go out and, again, write a process flow to query that data, send me an alert, and then I know that I can take action on it in the system without actually having to be in the system to see that notice.
Right.
Now, I mentioned earlier email actions, and we saw that email that had the buttons in the bottom. And what this allows you to do is, that's why we want to present as much information as we can in that email notification, because you can put those actions right in that email, and the user doesn't actually have to log into the system to do something, to perform that action. Think about from a time perspective, okay, it takes a couple minutes to get logged in and bring the screen up and render all that. If you can put it all in the email and enable those buttons, the user clicks the button and they are forced to authenticate into the system, but just so that the system knows who's actually clicking the button. There's a couple options here. You can change the base URL if you need to change the endpoint, so maybe you're opening that up externally. That's always the question, will these email buttons work? I get my email on my phone, can I click it right there? And of course there's all kinds of firewall things and endpoint things and all of that that come into play there. Security. So force authentication, which is what requires the user to log in when they click that button, used to be an option. Now, starting with 10.11 CU 56, I believe, it was just announced this fall, that is going to be required moving forward, so it would no longer be an option, and users must always authenticate when performing an action from an email. There is also an allow forwarding option. So if you think about this, so what's going to stop me from forwarding my email to someone else and somebody else clicking that button? This allow forwarding option, if you set it to false, the system will say, the system knows who it sent the email to because there's a unique URL string behind that button. If the person who logs into the system is not who that action is coded to, the system will reject it if that allow forwarding is set to false.
That's a huge advantage now.
Yeah.
That used to be a problem that prevented a lot of people from even using those email buttons.
Right. And you can also, you can say, build logic into your flows. If you allow forwarding equal true, you can build logic into the flow to say, okay, and using the users variable and the auth users variable. So the users variable will tell you who the system assigned it to, and the auth users will tell you who actually authenticated into the system to do it. So maybe I, as a manager, am forwarding my emails to my director. The system, you can code your process flows to look to see, okay, is that auth user higher up in the HR supervisor chain? If so, then I'm going to allow that action to take place. And again, here is that email, just with the buttons down here at the bottom. You'll see this is configured in each user action node. There's a checkbox to allow email actions, and the system will automatically put those buttons in the bottom of the email for you.
So I touched a little bit about on reason codes before. The reason code really is a good shorthand way for us to really ask the question, why? So we kicked off this transfer action, but why are we allowing this? Why is this an important or relevant action that we should allow or disallow? So the reason code is going to give us that quick, we've downsized the department, so we're cutting this person's FTE. We can definitely put that in as a reason code. It's going to be used especially, the approvals are one thing, but especially when it comes down to the return or rejecting it, we want to know why we're rejecting it or why we're returning it. If we want to send it back to that initiator to actually go in and modify it in some way and allow them to kick it off again, we want to give them a good reason code on why it was returned in the first place. Oh, you forgot to keep it within the parameters that are allowed in the contract. You can build that in as a reason code. You can have them be optional or required. That's absolutely no problem. And more importantly, with the ability to define custom subjects, we can have custom reason codes just for that user action. So we don't have to worry about adding it to just the generic HCM subject, which has 50 billion reason codes already. We can tailor it down to just this specific custom action, which will allow these specific reason codes. So to do that, within each one of these approval nodes, we're going to be able to have in the action builder itself, show reason code pop-up. So whenever somebody is kicking it off and they're going to return or reject it, it's going to pop right up on the person's screen requiring that reason code. And we can also require comments to be added into it as well. Again, those are requirements that we're able to build onto the form itself. And here's where we can check the custom subject. So if we wanted to have that very specific reason code just for that action, here's where we're able to define that down or parse it down from all of the reason codes down to just these few that are allowed for this specific action. So you can see here we clicked on the reject button and it popped up right away and it says, all right, well, what's the reason? Why? What is the reason code that we're rejecting this? And because we also required the message to be, or the comments to be put in, it's going to make sure that somebody enters the values into those fields. So the approval history, we talked about it a lot with the audit logs and just the overall history view. Most important with it is we can see who approved it and when they approved it. For some organizations, there are problems where managers will let something sit in their in-basket for weeks on end and they never approve it. And then they get very upset because why hasn't this person transferred? Well, you never approved it. We can see all of that in our audit log history, and we are capturing all of those things on the action request itself, who approved it, when they approved it, etc. The other thing that we can start to do is see, as this is still sitting out there waiting for people to approve it, what are the metrics on it? Like, how long is it taking for managers to actually approve these things? When are they getting the notification, and are they actually approving it in a timely fashion? Very important metric to have. I always say to people, what gets measured gets managed. If you've got that problem where managers are not signing off on things, you're going to start to look at your approval metrics and see whether or not people are signing off on things in time. And sure enough, if you provide those managers with a report, or those senior level managers saying the line managers just are waiting 3 weeks before they do anything, that all of a sudden you're going to see those times start to shrink down if we start pinging people on it, basically.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the S3 interface. So this is Infor's gift to you. This is delivered with the CU, delivered with the application. And this is the interface that takes all of that GHR data, all of your system of record data, and passes it down to Lawson S3 so that you can run payroll or extract your benefits if you're still running benefits out of there. It is triggered by a service, and it's selectable by business class. So there's all the business classes about an employee, their work assignment, their data, the jobs, positions, supervisors, all that information, depending on how you're using the system and what data you need to transfer down to S3, you can select that all. You can use IPA to build a custom IPA flow to sequence them all together. So there are certain processes that are dependent on another one running previously. So this is just an example flow that's taking 4 different business classes that are dependent and need to be run in a certain sequence. And it's kind of stringing them all together. So it's triggering another flow, waiting for that one to finish. In this example here, we're actually capturing error messages that may come back from any one of these if there's an issue triggering the flow or anything like that, and capturing that and sending an email. Maybe you're also, after it's successfully completed, you send a final email notification to your HR folks or whoever's running the LT111 process on the S3 side to then take those transactions and process them.
Something else with the S3 interface and tying into the reason codes, there's something that's really powerful which people a lot of times don't use, and that is action reason mapping. So if you have users on the S3 side, for example, your payroll department, and they always want to know about certain actions that have occurred. Obviously, when we're running the interface from GHR, it doesn't actually perform those actions anymore because it's being updated through the LT101 or LT111. But if you do something called reason mapping, you're actually able to choose a specific reason code in GHR, and it will create something that looks like the personnel action on the S3 side. So payroll can still run something like a PA 340 and see, oh, this person had a termination action come through. and that would be driven off of those reason codes. So yet another reason to use the reasons, I guess.
And one thing to note that it's best practice to take these delivered flows and just leave them as is. The functionality is changing slightly as they improve the processes and fix things along the way. If you're taking those delivered interface flows and tweaking them, well, the next time you apply a CU, you're going to have to take that and retrofit your changes back into that newest version, just depending on what has changed within those.
Right, and now with the cross-reference mappings, you really don't have to touch those interfaces anymore. You don't have to go in anymore and modify the process flow to get a user field over to S3. You just do it through the mapping on the cross-references, and that tends to take care of it. So hands off the delivered interface.
Yep.
So we've talked about some of the action requests and how you might kick off certain actions and things like that. But something else that you can use within GHR and IPA within GHR is you can actually build in your own custom imports and exports. So this is not the generic interface over to S3 or anything like that. But let's just say that we needed to import a whole bunch of information from a third-party system. We talked earlier about talent acquisition purposes. If we had a third-party talent acquisition system and we needed to import all of those candidate records, you can actually do that through IPA to send or receive this information from a flat file and import it into the system. We could also build an IPA that is going to go through and query a whole bunch of information, put it into a file, and then send it off by email to a specific user. This is not using business intelligence or anything else, but this is actually running it through a process flow itself. And you can also go through and notify users when things are done. So these are just a couple other options that you would have for IPA within it. So talking about our candidate import, for example, this is a process flow we built out for somebody a long time ago now. But all this is doing is it's pulling in everything about talent acquisition, somebody who applied for a requisition, they wanted to use the back end of talent acquisition for managers and recruiters to disposition people and everything, but there was a third-party interface already sitting, or third-party system already sitting out there to collect the applicant data. Their ATS was solid, they didn't care about that, but they wanted to use manager space. So right here within this data iterator node, you can click on the next one, we actually are able to define exactly, okay, here's the CSV file that we want you to import. And then the rest of this process flow is going through every single one of those lines on the CSV file and importing that record into the talent acquisition system. We can also do the same kind of thing if we wanted to run a SQL query within a process flow and burst that information out to managers or whomever needs to get this information. You can see that we've built out a SQL query right inside the process flow. It's going to pull together all that data, it's going to compile it into a specific form, and then we have an email that's going out to those people saying, here's our new file, here's more information that you needed. So again, it's just a little bit of a different use of an IPA to perform some of these functions for reporting. So talking about the reporting, again, we're not using business intelligence on it. Nothing against business intelligence, but this might be something that maybe is a little bit more basic, and we don't need to spend the time to build out an IPA or build out BI for it. It's just going to be very basic. And say we needed to submit out or send to managers a list of all their employees, something like that. We can do that pretty quickly and easily without using BI and without, let's just say they didn't have manager space, something like that. That could be a use here. And then what we can also do with it is we can use the user tasks as our distribution list. So if it was being sent to Jeremy and he gets promoted within the organization, he doesn't need to receive that information anymore. We can just do it by user task and say, all right, we just changed it in there, we didn't have to change the process flow, Instead, whoever else we put into that position will start to receive that. The advantage of this is that we can start to schedule this distribution of this report. When we go in and kick off a process flow, we can just schedule that service to call this flow every week and send it out to a manager. So we can go to the next one. So this is an example of this, where we're querying a manager, and this is something we've built out for somebody to actually sign off to verify that they're actually, looking at their employee data. You'd be surprised how frequently people do not look at their own employee data in manager space. So we're kind of forcing people's hands on this one. So we're bursting out a report. We're writing a process flow that is pulling together all the staff for that particular manager, and we're sending it out to them on a weekly basis, and we're actually including an extra node inside there to actually make them go into their actions and say, yes, I have reviewed my current roster and these are my employees still. So we can definitely do that. Again, it's scheduled and it's going to pull through all that information without using BI. And so here's our little action node to actually have that manager go in and say, yep, these are my people. So kind of forcing people's hands. Okay. And the way we do that is you can see that we have the action node inside there, and you can go to the next one. And on our notify, we're saying notify all users of this action. So anybody who's in this distribution list, for example, is going to start to receive this report on a whatever basis, on a weekly basis, for example. And when we do that, one more time, I'm triggering this off of our user task. So I built out a user task called report distribution. Every time I invoke that report, and it's going to be called out to the report distribution group, you can see that all these people are going to start to receive that report as often as it's run. So Jeremy and I are both going to receive this. If Jeremy gets promoted, when Jeremy gets promoted. So if that happens, we're able to very quickly go in and change this and change who's going to receive it without hard coding the IPA. Okay.
And with that, we'll take any questions.
We have some. All right, let's see here. Some of them refer back to the beginning. Obviously, if the folks in the audience have more, please go ahead and put them in. For auditing things like approvals and comments, will that be stored in the process log?
Yes, comments and approval information is all stored in the PFI tables associated with the process flow in the work unit.
Which ones are state processes? Name change, address change, others?
Yep, those are the two. There are three big ones: name change, address change, and it's set under the organization configuration. And I'm stalling because I'm trying to remember which one it is. But the three that show up on organization configuration are the state
leave of
actions.
absence, I believe.
Maybe
is that one?
Maybe it is.
I
Yeah.
think, yeah.
So they're very few and far between, but those are at least two of them.
Okay. Is there a crying baby there? Please rest assured that no babies were harmed in the making of this webinar. Can we add return option for final approvers? We only see reject for final. Very limiting.
Yeah, you can absolutely add as many different permutations of approval on that if you want.
So that would be defined in the process, in the user action that goes to that final approver. The reject or return, whichever one was missing,
Right.
is probably just not listed as a valid action for
Right.
that user action node.
Okay.
I've actually seen one client who went into their user action and they had like 5 different choices for the person. So they could approve, return, reject, forward to somebody else for a different approval, or I can't remember what the 5th one was, but just remember there are 5. So you can definitely add those in there.
And I've worked with clients who wanted to specifically remove the reject action from certain levels because they didn't want them to
Flat out reject it.
flat out reject it and cancel it.
Right.
We're going to up our IPA trivia level here to the next level. If a manager attempts to approve a requisition that's already been approved, what will they see? T2.
Okay, so we're talking about a job requisition, I'm assuming?
I presume. Yeah.
Okay, so it depends upon what you put on the user node. If you have the user node configured that if one person takes action, it can go through, then that will disappear from their in basket. If you can also configure it so that everybody has to take the same action before it moves on, so maybe 5 people would have to approve it.
In the case of if it's an email action, so the user is still going to have that email sitting in their inbox, and they click on the approve button, they'll see a message that says this action has already been taken or no valid action for this task, something like that. But they will be prevented from actually having the system take the action again if it's configured to have only one, or depending on how it's configured.
The one thing that
translation table. The translation screen.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but they can't hear it.
Yeah. The translation screen.
The one thing that I know that Infor was working on, and I haven't tested it yet on 1101, there was a request that if a certain percentage of people took the same action, approve it. I know that was a frequent thing that came up at in forum. I'm not sure if that's out there yet, but I know that in theory that's on their roadmap somewhere.
Right.
Is there any way to report on the effective date and reason of the action request with Spreadsheet Designer? So that would usually query the landmark business.
So there is an action request business class, and I'm just can't remember all the specifics around that. What specifically were they looking for again? What was the?
Well, they want to be able to query effective date and reason of action request with Spreadsheet Designer.
I believe those are all on that action request business class that you can get that information.
So we believe that answer to be yes. If we were to approve actions early, rather than waiting until the effective date, how might we deal with conflicting earlier dated but submitted actions?
Right. I'll start with that one. You probably have a much better answer than I do on this. Something I have seen people do is when there's a future dated action sitting out there, they'll actually display a flag at the top of the work assignment or employee, whatever it happens to be, to say, hey, there's a pending action sitting out there, be careful what you're doing. And then when it got to the level, I've seen some people where they lock it down completely. If there's a pending action, they may not even take another action. I've seen some people who wait until it gets to that approval level to, it's usually ends up going to an HR admin or something, and the HR admin would determine which of those actions would be valid and either reject that one or approve it and get rid of the other one that was sitting out there.
So really those are process solutions. It's a challenge to automate it anyway.
Yeah. Do you have anything?
No.
Something?
All right, I think those are all the questions for today. I want to thank Mr. Matt Slazak, Mr. Jeremy Stolfus.